almost certainly a scene of love or wedding, because there's Diana's crescent moon is in the top right-hand corner, barely visible. It's a quite luxurious object. The foreground leaves are gilded, so it's a highly decorative object. What Uccello has done there is an emblematic hunt. Actual hunts weren't conducted like that. First of all, they're not done at night, but it's Diana's homage to Diana, so they're done at night. Secondly, you required two sorts of hounds. You had greyhounds who chased the prey down, and you had mastiffs, big dogs who made the final kill. Uccello has only got greyhounds. They work perfectly well, they leap around, they give lots of energy, and he probably didn't particularly want the ugly mastiffs disturbing the delight of the scene. We undertook scientific analysis of this picture when it was in Cambridge, and I was at Cambridge at that point. And we discovered underneath this painting a series of perspectival grids. So under there is a tiled floor, as it were. And what he can then do is he can take each figure, each horse and rider, each dog, and slide them back perspectively on the scale. So every one of these can be plotted according to how big they are in the actual picture and how they diminish. And this almost certainly was a luxury item for a piece of furniture, something like a lettuccio, a day bed, or maybe an actual bed. Since it's concerned with Diana and the goddess of love, maybe it's an actual bed. It perhaps gives us a bit of pause to think that these revered old masters actually were functional objects. And in an inventory, you would expect to find a lettuccio is worth more than the painting. The different systems of value at work. Other pictures by Uccello, perhaps most famously the three episodes in the Battle of San Romano. This is the one in the National Gallery, London. It's a totally terrible slide. I do apologise for that. I didn't realise it's so awful. Other one in the Louvre and another one in the Uffizi. Here I think we can begin to see the chaos of battle reduced to a certain amount of perspectival order. You can see that the lances that going into the background are canted like bits of the tiled floor. You've got cross members as well. So there's a complete scale. With Antonio Cremonese, who's a great person in vision analysis, we did an analysis of the space of this, and again we uncovered a kind of tiled floor. So the whole of the battle, this chaos of battle, is subjected to this optical rule. And the commander there, Nicholas de Tolentino, gesturing to his horses and wearing an absolutely spectacular hat. The hat has got a mazzocchio inside it. This is a faceted donut-shaped object which padded out a hat. You can see, there was one in the. Let me go back to that. You can see the one that the horseman is wearing there. The reason it's so big is because it's a faceted hat. In the flood and the interpretation of the flood, we see one of the soldiers one of the fighting men on the left. His whole hat has been swiped away. His mazzocchio has dropped down on his head. In the top right, those are figures by Mazzolino, the colleague of Masaccio, just to show you the kind of hat effects. And there below you see the details of the mazzocchio. The flood and the recession of the flood. On the right, the ark is navigating. There's lots of chaos as chaos reigns in the flooded earth and people fight each other and so on. Leaves are ripped off trees. And interestingly here, if you do the vanishing points, they actually cross over. So he's saying, you had to analyse it to see that, but he's saying these are two separate scenes in a single one. And the reason you know it's two separate scenes is because they have different vanishing points. The angle is slightly different. Strange, quirky use of these devices in narratives. We have either from Uccello or from followers indications of these prized objects, the mazzocchi, these donut-shaped, faceted ones. Whether these are by Uccello or not, he clearly made this kind of drawing. And it's not easy. A lot of patience, a lot of plotting, and they are something of a test as whether you really do perspective. If you could do a Mazzocchio, you could do almost anything. On the right, an extraordinary chalice, again probably by Uccello. In 1992, for the big Columbus celebrations, we did a film called Masters of Illusion, looking at illusionistic techniques in painting with Hollywood special effects people, all men at that time, so special effects men, though they should have had some women, but there we are. And I showed them this, and they said, yes, what is it? And I said, well, it's Uccello drawing, and it's about 1440s. They said, no, what's the date? I said, it's 1440s. And they couldn't believe that this wireframe technique, which is used heavily in computer graphics at that time and is still used in a particular kind of way, they were just astonished at this technique. It was rather pleasurable, shocking special effects filmmakers with a 15th century object, but that's what we managed to do. And the Mazzocchio appears all over the place. It ceases to have a narrative importance and becomes saying, look what I can do. I can do the Mazzocchio. This is in the Gubbio Studiolo. There's a studiolo in Washington, in Urbino, the great hill town of Urbino. And there was a second Intarsia Studiolo in Gubbio, which was also in Federico da Montefeltro's reign. Difficult to photograph these studioli. You can't get sufficient width. You use wide-angle cameras and things go all over the place. But sitting on one of the seats in the Gubbio Studiolo is a Mazzocchio. It's gone slightly wrong at the back. The rectangles and squares don't quite go as they should, but it's pretty impressive nonetheless. And there's an example of stretching your optical muscles, as it were, to do a Mazzocchio. Piero della Francesca, mathematics and meaning, and he is by far the greatest use of perspective, I think probably of all time, including Leonardo. The famous picture in this respect is obviously the flagellation of Christ, which still warrants analysis. What is going on here? It's a small picture. The outside wooden bits are where the wooden frame has been torn away from the picture, leaving a jagged edge with the gesso priming. But it's nice to see the whole extent of the picture. What's going on here? You've got the flagellation of Christ being supervised by Pontius Pilate, with the men flagellating Christ, and three rather different looking people outside, an aristocrat, a youth wearing no shoes, and an oriental figure of some sort. And originally the frame had the Latin phrase convenerunt in unum. They conspire together, or they conspire as one. So I think what the meaning of the picture is, and this is not unique interpretation by myself, it's an example of saying these variety of people all were responsible for Christ convening together, and that we should be careful not to convene with those forces of destruction. The perspective is just extraordinary. Here you've got the full extent of what you can deduce about this perspective structure, beginning with the squares, the larger squares in the front, going back with a series of bars, and then into an area where it's simply too tight to draw individual lines. They were meticulously done. For a television program, we built a physical model of this. I should have brought the slide of that, and it worked out amazingly. You could turn this Piero into actual architecture with very little doubt until you get right back in the shaded area as to what the dimensions of things are. The tiled floors are incredibly elaborate and cerebral. Piero thinks through every bit of geometry has a meaning to it. He's got various techniques of foreshortening. In his book De Prospectiva Pingendi, on the perspective of painting, he shows how any point, represented here by P on the left one, how any point can be located in an equivalent point in a foreshortened square. So you've got the square, you've got a point, you flip the square into perspective, and you can identify where the point is. And given that you can do complicated figures, you can create this octagon which is twisted, whereas you can plot each point separately. A lot of patience. Piero used something he called paper rulers. which had little marks on them to do this. The floor on which Christ stands is a circle. He is flagellated in the perfect geometrical form at the center of the universe, as it were, the black circle. But the other tiles are rather interesting. This is the one I used in my book. There are a series of squares and diamonds, and the way the mathematics of this work out is that the length of the diagonal on the small squares, if you take one of the small squares, draw a diagonal, turn that in, and then do a square with that side length. So the whole thing is linked in together. This is incommensurable. You can't turn it into arithmetical figures. It's an incommensurable ratio. Outside, it's a straight mathematical division. The tiled floor is just basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The bit before Christ is this complicated transfer of root 2 from one figure to another. So there's a kind of a spiritual hierarchy at work here: the perfect square, the incommensurable ratios, and the dead boring arithmetical divisions. So there's a kind of cerebral hierarchy of geometries at work here. It may sound rather sophisticated, but it actually works fantastically well. And Piero was an educated man. Borgo San Sepolcro, his family were minor aristocracy, and unlike most artists, he had a good education, and he wrote a book on the 5 regular solids, which was a mathematical textbook on the 5 regular solids, as defined by Euclid and taken up by Plato. Piero inevitably also tried his hand at the Mazzocchio with a rather perfect way, and he did it by plan and elevation in this case. You've got the plan of a Mazzocchio, and you can do it at each level, have a different plan. And he's then working out on the intersection, on the picture plane, where they intersect. And he has this technique, as you see on the right, of writing down the coordinates. Terrific in concentration in that. Very elaborate focusing, again using these paper rulers. And that one you see, the Mazzocchio is beginning to be finished in its three-dimensional form, but all those little figures around them are recording the positions that the rays strike the crossing. You can do it with heads. The advantage of this technique is you don't need a regular solid to do it. You can create a series of marks on the head, and you can then track those across to the eye and record where these dimensions appear. You do as many slices as you want. Basically, you do one there, one there, one there, one there, and one there. And each one is a separate construction. You put down the notation down, you then draw it up, and it becomes a head. Once you've done that, you can tilt the head as you like. You can simply alter the dimensions of the head. This is a head looking upwards. And if we look at his actual pictures, we will see just this being applied. This is the resurrection of Christ in the town hall of Borgo San Sepolcro. Borgo San Sepolcro is the house of the Holy Sepulchre. It's dedicated to the Holy Sepulchre. This is on the town hall wall. And here we've got Christ rising from his tomb. He's not foreshortened. It would be bad manners to foreshorten Christ, as it were. Whereas the sleeping soldiers who completely miss what's going on, miss the light, are foreshortened. They're subject to this kind of mathematical distortion in a way, which Christ wasn't. So always, with the great practitioner perspective, meaning is there. They're not just doing space mathematics for the sake of the enjoyment, which is real, but there's always linked in with meaning, with mathematics and meaning, as I said. But there is something else in Piero da Francesco which has really been largely ignored. The medieval textbooks, whether Islamic or whether they're European, had 3 books on the optics. There was direct sight, what happens when light is coming in directly. There's reflected sight, reflected light, and there's refracted light. And these are the 3 books. And it does seem to me that we spend time thinking, well, linear perspective is optical and that's it. There are other optical things going on, including incredibly elaborate analysis of curved mirrors, of transmission of light through various media. And if we look at Piero da Francesco, we can see this sort of thing happening. The altarpiece in the Brera, the Frederica da Montefeltro of Urbino, kneeling adoration with a series of saints. Let's think a bit about the perspective here. Where are the figures in relation to this architecture? They look as if they're slightly set back towards that niche. Do we read the egg as being vertically above the Virgin? I think we do. But if we look at St. John's arm, it's not really very visible in this picture. His arm and elbow overlap the crossing, the little sliver of pilaster which you see there. So if you go with St. John's arm, then the figures are actually right over the crossing, which then means the egg must be very big. And it's almost certainly an ostrich egg. The ostrich egg was taken as a symbol of virgin birth, because ostriches were supposed to bury the eggs in the sand and they hatch spontaneously with this kind of the clever agility of icon makers to getting meaning out of this kind of thing. But it is a tricky perspective. You get the sense that they're in the architecture, but they're in fact in front of the architecture. There's a play on space and surface, which is very elaborate, very beguiling. In the upper parts of the architecture, we see very remarkable effects of reflection. First of all, direct illumination and very beautifully judged shadow on the conch shell. But let's see if I can get a pointer working. Yeah. If you look here, the shadow falls on that cornice there. If we look here, I think it is the area there is actually lighter than the surrounding shading areas. I'm sorry, that's not very well demonstrated, but he's very acutely aware that where you've got direct light, you get shadow on the receding features. Where it's reflected light, you get you get light on the receding features. So he's working rebounds in that case. And the most obvious thing in terms of reflection is Duke Federico's armor. Is this studied in an actual building? We could make a reasonable guess as to what the windows would be like in this building. It'd be interesting to do a computer analysis to see whether there's any rationale for this at all. My guess is about 50%. I wouldn't be surprised to find a rational analysis of these convex forms, but convex mirrors were a great source of attention, so you don't necessarily need it to be done deliberately as reflections, as to referring to this noble science of light. In Arezzo, we've got the Mary Magdalene on the wall of the cathedral. To her right, our left, as we're looking at it, a series of windows in the western facade, and we look at the ointment oil. Wonderful, wonderful bits of painting going on there of internal reflection and refraction and reflection of the windows, and the diffuse light goes through and catches on the far side of the glass jar. It's a ravishing set of reflections and refractions, I suspect done on the basis of looking at actual flasks full of water of that kind, or even of oil. Anyway, here he's saying, don't forget the reflections, don't forget the refractions. It's not just perspective. The National Gallery in London, we've got this very beautiful skirt with these jewels on, and in the shadows, the jewels are still picking up refracted glimmers of light, so that they stand out. They're very beautiful. He looked at things incredibly hard. One of the most intriguing refractions is in the early picture in the National Gallery in London, the baptism. And in the baptism, you've got Christ is standing in water. And if you can't see it in any of the details, you have to look at the painting. Around his ankles, you've got little rivulet, little rings of light, little ripples of light. So he's standing in water. In fact, what he's showing there is that if you're looking down at a steep angle, you can see through to Christ's feet. If you look at a glancing angle, you see the background and the hills in the background. So he's saying there's a difference between looking down at that angle and looking along a shallow angle. And these photographs I was done in the Australian National University, as it happens, and you see the grid visible in the bottom left-hand corner, and it gradually transitions into total reflection. And the same happens with a more internal, limited one. Now, in practice, the transition between seeing through and seeing off is rather gradual. Now, I wonder if Piero has actually formulated it deliberately as a rule that at a certain critical angle, it goes through, at a different, slightly critical angle, it bounds off. So it may be he's formulated a rule which is too sharp for the actual phenomenon, but it would be very characteristic of him to do that. And this we saw in an earlier lecture, the Senegalia Madonna with its remarkable effect of the light streaming in through the window and catching these little bits of leaping dust, these atomi as Leonardo called them, in the air. You could see the light comes in through the window. It's then visible with thousands of little tiny spots of light impasted paint, and then hits the wall in this way. Very beautiful transition through the medium. And I thought I'd test it to see, does it actually look like this? This was done in the basement of my house at that point in Scotland. And I created a fire and cut out a hole in a box, much to my wife's anxiety, and flooded it with smoke at the corner. And why is this? I experimented, and it's almost certainly depends on your angle of vision. At a certain angle of vision, you don't get the reflection off the atomi, off the little particles, the dust particles. And Piero's got it. This is somebody who looks hard. To notice that is just extraordinary and would suggest, yes, he's going to do the atomi, but he doesn't just look at them in any window. He actually, National Museum, maybe elsewhere, but we're talking to the National Museum, curated by Jay Levinson, who did.
以及一个短缩法，一个遮挡，就是他认为这个是一种非常类似公布里希分类方法的一种解释，可以解释中国绘画的空间、人物位置、形态的一种方法。那么我最后就是以这个结束，他提出五个方法，一种是尺度的梯度，一种是叫清晰的梯度，第三个叫质地的梯度，第四个叫短缩，第五个叫遮挡。好的，谢谢。
谢谢李老师。谢谢李阳老师刚才对肯普老师讲授的内容进行了一个透视法一般的一个总结和回顾。那我们接下来就进入到回应和对谈的环节。那在这个环节当中，我们特别邀请到了北京大学艺术学院客座讲席教授、美国密歇根大学荣休教授 Professor Martin Powers 包华石老师。好，我来简单介绍一下，包老师是著名汉学家、艺术史学家，研究聚焦艺术在中国历史，尤其是社会历史层面的表现和影响，关心个体力量和社会公益的艺术表达。那么两位教授曾经在2年前何为佳作系列的讲座当中进行过对谈，那今天可谓算是再续前缘，一起在线下一起进行讨论。那么请包老师上台评议补充和拓展一些中国艺术相关的内容。
谢谢刘老师的介绍。First, I would like to thank Wang Ruijun, Jing Li, and Tony Zhu for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation with Martin Kemp. It's a great honor for me, and also the opportunity to speak to all of you and online. I'd like to say just a few words in Mandarin before I get started. 就是女士们好，先生们好，同事们好，线上的朋友们下午好。这样，我们现在知道肯普教授对于宋代绘画史很感兴趣，等几分钟我就要给他提供一些信息，我觉得是有关的信息跟观点，就是让他考虑一下，这样对我们的对话 会让我们的对话多多顺利一些。那既然它是我主要的我讨论的主要的可以说对象，是不是？所以我非用英文不可，这是逃不掉的一回事。请大家多多包涵。Okay, I think we need to bring up my slides. Oh, thank you. Okay, just a few comments. I don't plan to take a lot of time. First of all, like Professor Kemp, I don't see this as a contest to figure out who did it right or who did it best. Cultures across the world develop different ways of organizing pictorial space, sometimes relatively deep space. And what is remarkable, and again, I agree with him completely, is that especially in northern Song China, or actually in Song China period, and in Renaissance Italy, we find so many techniques that are really quite similar. I'd like to move back as a historian and point out that in both Renaissance Italy and in Song China, the bigger picture, if you take the bigger picture, what's happening is a movement away from a medieval world to what historians call a more modern sort of social formation, whatever that may mean. And in the medieval art of China, as in Europe, we find not only images that are perhaps less detailed than those we find in the Song or in the Renaissance, but are images of things that no one has ever really seen, right? No one ever encountered a Buddha that looked like this, much less one that was like 5 or 6 stories tall, right? So its existence was assured by the Buddhist Church or the Catholic Church, for example. Oops, I think I breathed on it and altered it. How do I get back to, really I just breathed on it and it changed.
Do you want to go back downwards?
Yeah. Okay. So when you get to the Song, even in Buddhist images, we find images like this, which people could say, well, yeah, actually, I've seen someone like that. You know, I've seen the way that cloth moves like this, the weight of cloth, the tension in the muscles, for example, the expression on the face. These are things I've seen. These are things that people can publicly confirm on their own without the authority of the church, of either the Catholic Church or the Buddhist Church. The same with the very lively, intelligent look in these women's eyes, also dating to Northern Song. If it's painting, you see a similar story, not unlike Europe. Not much interest in light or texture, much less gradients of light or texture, pretty much flat, decorative. And in this case, you have several kinds of, several horizons in several spaces in one scene, each with its own horizon, as you see here. But then when you get to the Song, artists again are interested in a level of detail which we can all attest to. We've all seen rabbit fur that looks, quite a bit like that, or fish that lumber along. You can count every scale, every bone, and pretty much verify that with an ichthyologist. And then fish that are moving too fast, so you don't see the bones. The artist doesn't show us the bones because you wouldn't have seen them through the water. Professor Kemp has gone through many of the techniques that are shared by the two cultures, but I want to mention a few others. Of course, we have the horizon, especially set low, which tends to be more convincing. We have the repertoire, that is to say, a large object up close to the picture plane, which allows the artist to give you a sense of the depth of space behind it. It's a very common technique in Song painting, foreshortening again here, and a level of detail again, which people could confirm. People in Song times, according to Joseph Needham, you could, even today, we can reconstruct these movable rudders from a picture like this. Also, as Professor Kemp mentions, texture gradients, which you see here, and scale gradients. These being distant forests, which nonetheless the artist has very carefully rendered, but in a way which is likely not perspectively or mathematically accurate, and yet which looks convincing. The effects of time on objects, so we can see this bridge has been around for too long and needs repair. Another feature which is mentioned in Song Dynasty painting texts is that the artist should pay attention to the what we would now call ecological environment that in which an object is growing, in which a tree or other plant is growing. This is an early painting, 10th century, but we see here, this is probably sandy soil, and you can see the water runs down here, and the sand gathers down here. You could see the sand clumping, or the clay clumping toward the bottom, which is exactly what would happen. Likewise, the texts tell us that when you see roots at the surface of the soil, it's because the water there isn't much water. And of course, in sandy soil, the trees indeed would have trouble holding on to the water. So the artists were out there in nature paying attention and looking at these things. And we know this also from the rock texture, which involves several layers of texture strokes, so that looking at it today, it looks as if no two texture strokes are the same, and yet all of them we can read as limestone rock texture. And one reason they were able to achieve this effect is a technique which Tai Xiangzhou, a famous artist here in Beijing, and also an art historian, has discovered how it was done. And apparently they used glazes. They would lay down a layer of light texture strokes, and then a glaze, and then another layer, and then a glaze, and then another layer, very much the way Renaissance artists worked with glazes to get a more complex and deeper sense of form. Also here you can see the artist looked at the way that growing in a gully like this would affect these plants. They're stunted because the only water they get is probably from the mist, the water droplets that land on the rock. And so the roots are growing at the surface, and also the growth has been stunted. And also you see the branches all move this way because the winds must be very high in a gully like that. And so the trees would not be able to grow in a direction where the winds were strong. So this level of observation gives a credibility to the painting, which is very different from the credibility that would come from, say, the Bible or a Buddhist scripture. And contemporaries notice this. So, for example, Dong You writes, he says, when you gaze at Li Cheng's paintings and his command of physical appearance, suddenly you forget you're looking at a painting. People are amazed at this and think it the work of spirits. How could a human being have done this? And I must say, I feel that way when Professor Kemp explains what Leonardo accomplished. And I think to myself, my God, how could a human being have done this? You know, perhaps it's the work of spirits. Another parallel is the use of light. Obviously, the Chinese artists were not as interested in dramatic and sharp contrasts in light, but you do see it in landscape painting. The evening sun is falling on this mountain side here, and it reflects onto this little hillock here, which is why this is brighter than these parts which are dark in shadow. The light's coming from over there, so these are in dark shadow. This part's a little bit lighter because of the reflection there. We also find reflection in water, such as you see here. But something else which is going on here, which is of great interest because it does parallel the Renaissance, and I don't know if any other culture does this quite systematically. That is, there is an attempt to create a device which will convey a sense of deep recession, of gradual and deep recession in space, and also create a sense of unity. This had not happened before Li Cheng. Li Cheng created what Chinese art critics at the time called the Pingyuan, and what the rather bad English translation is level distance. What that actually refers to is this zigzag, some kind of a zigzag, where the zigzags are so complex and numerous that they appear to be perfectly natural, and they appear to go gradually and inexorably into deep space. So this is mentioned very often by the critics. Liu Daochun, late 11th century, he tells us when you view, for example, figure paintings, 人物画, you should look for, specific things. And when you look at paintings of seawater, you should look for specific things. When it comes to landscapes, he says, when viewing landscapes, you should pay mind to the treatment of level distance and deep space. So here you can see that level distance and deep space are combined conceptually. And it's really the level distance that allows these paintings to convey a sense of unified space. Another feature of these paintings, and I should go back a bit here, is that the horizon is consistent. This particular painting is in Kansas City. It's 10 feet long. It's a hand scroll 10 feet long. The horizon never changes throughout all that time. So although there isn't a single point from which you're viewing it, the horizon remains the same. And this is true for all Northern Song landscapes in this tradition. Su Shi, for example, also refers to this. He speaks of a painting by Song Di, who painted in the Li Guo tradition. Winding paths scurry toward distant mountains, far-off creeks report to foreground streams. He's telling us that there's a Pingyuan there. Now, so in other words, the Pingyuan tried to achieve solve problems similar to one-point perspective, that is to unify space and to create a sense of deep recession. Now, another feature that Song has in common with the Renaissance is the theorization of space. And you might wonder why they did not pick up on, actually Shen Kuo did consider one-point perspective. Of course, he couldn't have done it anyway because he didn't have the mathematics, but he considered what would happen if an artist painted from one point of view, and he basically said, no, the cost is too high for that, we don't want to go there. One reason is that landscape painting in China since the 5th century was supposed to be a genre where you could wander in imagination. You could wander through the landscape in imagination, and that means that the point where you're at has to change. The horizon may not change, but the point where you're at horizontally needs to change. In terms of theory, and I'm almost done, but you really need to know this, the turn toward more, what you might call more accurate representation, or the idea that the authority of the painting comes from accurate representation, probably starts with Bai Juyi. He says, in painting, there is no single standard. Painting takes resemblance as its standard. And in learning, there's no single teacher. Learning takes, he means facts. If you read Bai Juyi, you know that's what he means. It takes facts as its teacher. Now note, that's a very radical thing to say. He is saying, no, the Buddha is not authoritative. Confucius is not authoritative. Christ is not authoritative. In the end, it's the facts that carry authority. And we know that he meant that. Actually, this is true for the Gu Wen thinkers generally. Now, the way that naturalism, or if you will call it that, I don't know, or accuracy was understood in Song painting theory was not unlike Diderot's theory of expression in the late 18th century. The idea was this, that if you look at actual trees and landscapes and waterfalls, they will arouse emotions in your heart and in your mind. And if an artist is able to imitate those appearances. If he's able to put those appearances into the painting, that also, excuse me, will arouse those emotions. So in other words, the artist becomes a poet. And in China, a poet's main subject is his or her own emotional expression. That is, the poet is supposed to convey their own emotions and ideas, 虚言志, right? Well, once artists came to be seen as poets, they began to question the whole idea of naturalism. So Dong Yo here says, excuse me, artists put their trust in skillful artistry, and they follow a set of rules and procedures, but how can you call that natural? He says, that's not natural. Natural, he's now turning on the other meaning of natural, coming out of the Taoist tradition, meaning whatever suits your personality or your feelings. So he's turning from an objective to a subjective mode. And Shan Kuo takes this even further. The wonder of painting and calligraphy lies in its capacity for imaginative encounter. Okay, it's not about looking like the object, the way Bai Zhiyi thought it should be. How can you achieve this through mechanical means? And then he notes that he's got a painting at home by the medieval artist Wang Wei. This guy is lying in the snow and there are banana trees. Of course, that's not possible. But he says, that's fine. Wang Wei did whatever was natural for him. As soon as the idea he arose, he put it down in the picture. The picture's logic enters into the imagination and returns as a natural thought. So this became a dominant way of thinking among literati artists who thought of themselves as poets working in painting. And by the way, this is also parallel to the Renaissance ut pictura poesis, right? So in Renaissance Europe, they also had this idea that art and poetry were a single art. They were sister arts. Something similar happens in China. And what happens in painting very shortly thereafter, this painting dates to about 1100. I'm showing you a detail. And it's by an artist who was one of the members of the literati circle. And it takes as its subject a famous poem by Su Shi, the main theorist in that circle, The Red Cliff. And what he does here, in the whole painting, he gets rid of the horizon. The horizon is gone. So in other words, the shared reality, which the horizon represents, is all gone. What we have instead are lines of sight. This one is direct. Okay, you're just looking straight across at that. And this one's at a high angle. This happens to be a moment in the poem when Su Shi is totally confused. He can't tell the difference between what's real and what isn't. The second time that happens, at the end of the poem, the same thing happens. Here we see Su Shi asleep. There we see him in his dream talking to two Taoists. The line of sight here is head on. The line of sight up there is vertical. And he puts them together in one composition. This is to let you know that he's the guy who's calling the shots. He's the one who's making these choices. This reflects his subjective choices. He's completely abandoned the horizon. And yet, in both cases, I think you could see there was a great deal that was shared, including the ideal of art and poetry as sister arts, the texture gradients, the light gradients, and at one point, at least, a real dedication to fidelity to the commonly shared image that people encounter in their everyday life. So that's by way of background, and I would look forward to having a chat with Professor Kemp.
好，谢谢包老师。请包老师在台上落座。也请肯普教授上台落座。Right, we'll welcome you back to the stage and have a conversation with Professor Powers.
Well, I need it in my pocket.
好，也请中控老师帮我们打开我们的帘幕，谢谢。
Thank you.
Please, we have like
Could you possibly go back to the last two of my presentation, which I forgot they were in?
Do you want to say something more?
Yeah, just I should say what they are, as they kept appearing. Yeah,
So like
no,
those
that's
two,
it.
right?
Those two, yeah. So this slide were meant to be the last slides of my lecture, and they kept appearing but didn't do anything. But I'll just explain what they're doing, as it is relevant to what we've been looking at. Normally,
不好意思，那个，哎，钟孔老师您好，
I'm actually
请问
talking
可以
about
这个，大屏幕可以稍微留一下吗？哎，谢谢。You can continue with this last two like images.
Yeah. These are the last two pictures of mine, and they're curious paintings. They're actually predella paintings along the base of an altarpiece. And as we saw with the Uccello, they're almost always separate, separate narratives or separate representations. Here we've got Piero Lorenzetti representation of the rule of the Carmelites in a single predella running across the whole scene. And below Fra Angelico follower, the Tibad, these are hermit saints. And again, run the whole length of an altarpiece, so they're proportionately not totally removed from scroll paintings. But I think it's interesting seeing an artist who doesn't have to do the orthodox single point perspective being released and doing something rather notable, if not Chinese, at least has some broad affinity with it. Anyway, that was what those bits were doing.
好的，谢谢。那在两位老师正式进行对谈之前，好像已经进行了几轮意见的交换了。那我们就是欢迎老师们继续基于刚才的文本进行对谈，然后请钟孔老师收一下屏幕，谢谢。
Oh, well, Martin, I wonder if we can follow up with that, because I noticed that Uccello, was it the Uccello, where he created a scene in proper perspective, and then there's another one beside it and another one beside it with different vanishing points.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me, that reminded me actually of the way that in that long scroll I mentioned that's 10 feet long, there's a similar device used where you get triangles, basically. So there's a level distance at the beginning of the scroll, and so you have things coming in and coming into that deep space, and then you come out to the front, and then there's another level distance, and then you come out to the front, and then there's another level distance. So across the whole scroll, there's 3 of them, and it basically follows this kind of zigzag structure similar to the Uccello, it seemed. So that does happen, and this also looks, it's a hand scroll type of composition. So is that common?
It's extremely uncommon because that format and function is not generally played to. And the argument I would make is that the perspectival single vanishing point painting in the Renaissance is about the function of it. The book we did for the Brera, we looked at the Raphael Sposalizio, the Marriage of the Virgin, and this was about the ring, which was a local relic of the Virgin. Therefore, everything in the main picture is about the ring, the marriage of the Virgin, and so on. So it's all highly centralized. There are a few paintings where you get sort of dispersed narratives. It'd be an interesting job, I think, for someone, maybe a good doctoral student, to look at works of art which don't have to obey that central dictatorial one. There are panoramas, of course, and the panorama was much engaged in the 18th and 19th centuries as an all-round representation. So it may be there's a good topic in there. If so, nobody's done it.
Well, I was also wanted to press you further on the gradients. I think they all make a great deal of sense, and I agree they are kind of Gombrickian. And of course, in Art and Illusion, Gombrich makes the argument that artists come up in different parts of the world, come up with different schemas, for dealing with these things. But nonetheless, your comparisons, or the argument you made today, I think, is a compelling argument for the idea that, yes, there are many different schemas, but they're kind of looking at the same things, or at least they're using a similar visual apparatus to look at it. I wonder if you might want to refine that, or if you have any further thoughts on that.
Yeah, my view on these things is fairly Gombrichian, but not entirely. But I think if there are certain hard-wired evolutionary things going on when we look at things, that we pick up some things in space very quickly, very well, and other things less well. We make errors of judgment as well. These obviously are expressed in different ways in different cultures, but I nonetheless think there are these really deeply dug in aspects of our perceptual life which are very functional. I'm holding this, and I'm holding it in a certain way with a certain reduced musculature, and it feels in a certain way. I think if you were holding yours, you'd have exactly the same feeling, and we could perhaps exchange views and maybe works of art on that. This doesn't mean that they're not deeply culturally conditioned, as they are, but they're culturally conditioned within that framework, or to exploit selectively what are biological equivalents. And you probably should remember that I was trained in natural sciences as a biologist, and perhaps I've never got over it.
Yeah, another factor that might be at play here, and I would ask you if this makes sense to you, is, of course, named artists had been known by name in Europe for quite some time before the High Renaissance, for sure, but and in China also. But when you get to what we call the Tang Song transition, the collection of art and the commissioning of art by artists increases exponentially. In other words, you have a much more learned collecting audience than you had before, and in China by the 10th century, you really have an art market. So I'm wondering to what degree this factors in to the development of Renaissance painting, which Baxendale suggested required quite a bit of education and learning to interpret properly.
Yeah, there is obviously in the Renaissance, and as you say, much earlier in Chinese art, a cultivation of what art is, what it means as a pursuit, what it is to be an artist, and so on. In the Renaissance, signaled by terms like ingegno, which is not exactly genius, but that kind of thing. Invenzione, fantasia, there are all these terms which are applied to art. And there's one which was very resonant for me in what you were describing, that the person liked to move at will. And there's a lovely correspondence with reporting Isabella d'Este's views. And Isabella d'Este was a very tyrannical patron. She was doing paintings for her studiolo, and she was commissioning a number of leading artists to do things, including Perugino. And she sends Perugino lengths of string to say how big the figures should be. And she gives him instructions of what to do. And she does the same with, Perugino gets on with it. Giovanni Bellini, on the other hand, is given similar kind of instructions. And the correspondence writes back saying, Messer Giovanni has taken this as badly as he could. He likes to wander at will in his paintings. And that's in a sense halfway to Giorgione, these rather freewheeling things. So, yeah, and Giorgione's paintings carry that example in Venetian in Venice. There are a set of very ambitious, young, educated patrons who like the puzzles, they like the tempesta, they like to be connoisseurs, they like to know more than the next person. So yeah, there's a very strong element of conscious patronage, which is often filled by theoretical statements as well. And I think it's quite a common thing there. But I'm conscious as a specialist in European art that almost everything we see happening in the Renaissance has already been done in China.
Oh, I don't know about that, but this is again one of those which I tend to think of as part of the structural. It's structural in a sense because it's part of the dynamic. No matter how much power the patron has, in the end, the artist is the expert. He's the one who has the knowledge and the skill to make things happen. And so it should be expected that there would be push and pull. And in China, I think that's most notable in the 10th century because that's when the aristocracy is in decline, and it's pretty much gone by the end of the 10th century. So before that, the artists start to really, the whole century before that, they start to push. And you get wonderful anecdotes. There's one of many of these artists were famous for getting drunk. They would get drunk and then splash all over the wall and paint. But nonetheless, this nobleman brought some very expensive paper and lots of expensive wine to this artist and wanted him to paint a scroll, a longhand scroll. So he said, fine. So he unrolled the whole piece of paper, and at the beginning of the scroll, which in China would be on the right, he painted a little boy holding a string. Mm-hmm. And then at the other end, he folded it into a kite. And in the middle, he just drew a long line from maybe 10-foot long line from the boy's hand to the kite. Yeah, this is a way of thumbing your nose at this blue blood. But there are, as you know, similar anecdotes in England in the 18th century, I believe.
Sure. Now you see the rise in the 15th century, in particular in Italy, of what I call the super artists, who consider themselves not to be the salaried people who paint on walls a given number of figures for a set amount of money. And the first of the super artists, you think of Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, but the first one is Andrea Mantegna in Mantua. And the Duke says, you have to humour these artists because they're a bit bizarre. And Andrea lived a princely life. He bankrupted himself and so on. But and there's a lovely anecdote to indicate the shift in power between patron and artist in the Renaissance with Michelangelo. He paints the Doni Tondo for Andrea Doni, the one which is the new Uffizi. And he sends that round and is sent back a sum of money, I'm not sure how many ducats. Michelangelo regards this as completely unacceptable. And he goes and gets the painting back, I hope I'm remembering this correctly, and doubles the price. And Doni has to put up with it. And there are all these things where artists are getting a bit big for their own shoes in a way.
Well, there's the market. You see, the market is, I would assume, is part of what's empowering Michelangelo. He knows he can go elsewhere if he needs to.
If Doni doesn't take the Tondo at 100 ducats, so somebody would take it at 200. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think Salvatore Rosa was famous for this sort of thing too. I think it's George Morland, isn't it, in England, who also liked the bottle. He liked to drink, and also tended to spurn the aristocracy. So these parallels I think are interesting. Again, I very much like the way you've set it up. It's not about a contest. It's about finding features of human behavior, which you might say are recurrent in history. Mm-hmm. They can appear early, they can appear late, they can appear in different places, but they're always irrevocably human. And it's part of being humanity rather than being part of this or that ethnic group. At the same time, recognizing that in all cases, it's done in a local manner and in a manner which is directed toward a local audience, but nonetheless in ways that are comprehensible to other people.
One of the things you notice historically, particularly say in Venetian painting, is that artists begin to learn when to stop. That's to say, to invite the spectator in. A lot of earlier art is very literal. What you see is what you get. It may be terrifically well done. But rather like Hitchcock movies, that what you see is what you scare yourself, because it's you doing it. And I think the great artists begin to know. Titian does this terrifically well. Velázquez does it spectacularly well. To do enough to suggest what's in the picture, but to stop short of spelling it all out. And if the artist can get you to do the work, do some of the imaginative work, it's much more compelling than the artist trying to persuade you to do it for his own account or her own account.
And it's, at some point, again, in both parts of the world, artists start doing pre-made paintings, and they just do what they want. It's in the shop or it's in the gallery, and people come in and buy it. This happened at several levels in Song China. Sometimes people would go to an artist studio and just buy what was there. But then also at a lower level, there was certainly a middle class or even lower middle class market for paintings. So like fan paintings, there were whole streets that made fan paintings, and you could find the artist you liked, and you could say, can you do me a bird and flower painting, or can you do me a landscape or whatever? And of course, they'd also have lots of ready-made fans. So this becomes part of tea culture. They started hanging paintings in tea shops, and it becomes part of course, in the temples. You find them in temple markets and so on. In that sense, Song China is somewhat reminiscent of Holland, I think. 17th century Holland, where you have this sort of thing going on, I think. Yeah.
You see in Italy, specialist painters, there's Simone dei Crocifissi, Simon of the Crucifix in Bologna, and he specializes in crucifixes. And you can have ones which are lavish with lots of gold, or you can have ones which are, there's a different price range of things. Leonardo is interesting in this. He said the artist should always have three types of pictures: the best ones, the less best ones, and ones which are disorte, which is not translatable, but means so-so. So you have off-the-peg pictures, some of which are very special and very expensive. You have middle-range pictures which are pretty good, and you have works which are just studio products. We don't like to think of Leonardo, the great genius, having this rather cynical attitude towards grades of painting, but the popular artists did this. Giovanni Bellini did it, lots of Madonnas. Botticelli did it. They had paintings which were disorte, which were okay for the lesser clients. You got what you paid for in that sense.
Well, they were businessmen, and what's interesting about that, of course, is it indicates that there again is a broader market. It's not just the dukes and the barons or whatever that are buying these things, but there's a broader spectrum, perhaps, that's interested in these things. And then, like I say, when you get to Holland, you really seem to have a middle class market there. So all this are things. All these are developments which one can find east and west. And again, if we were to, I don't have the expertise here, but if we were to turn to Japan, for example, and the middle class market that my colleagues tell me develops in about the same time, 16th, 17th century, in Japan, and then with the ukiyo-e prints, it expands to a much wider range of people, and the prints too were priced according to levels of finesse, from very expensive to very, very cheap.
Now, the inventories in Holland partly are revealed in relation to Vermeer and the relatively ordinary status of people who had good pictures is astonishing. You've got these inventories of people who are not that grand, and they've got some pretty good pictures. And of course, the Dutch artists were very prolific, many of them. They did a lot of pictures, but it's certainly not the aristocratic, wealthy patron, even the big money patrons. fairly ordinary people are getting pretty good pictures.
Yeah, and this is, again, it's surprising, and yet it seems to happen over and over. Some of the paintings we have, well, there's a pair of Southern Song fan paintings, landscapes in the Metropolitan that look a lot like those court-sponsored paintings. I showed one or two of them a minute ago, but in fact, they're not by the court artists, and they're not, at least I would argue that. I don't know, I think my colleagues at the Met would back me up on this. If you look closely, you can see that the very subtle washes were done very quickly. And that the whole painting could be done actually probably in an hour or 2 hours, something like that. This was something that was being sold to a general public. This was not a court painting at all. But if you look at it from a distance, it's absolutely gorgeous. I'm not saying it's low quality. They're really beautiful works of art, but they were done for an open market rather than, say, for the as a gift the emperor would give to some statesman.
Yeah, that actually triggers something slightly surprising in me, and that is the. Sorry, I lost the track of where I was going with that one. The speed of painting, the speed in which you can do something, and unless you're dealing with drawings in the Renaissance and later, well into the 19th century, they take quite a long time, paintings. They take time to dry, they're layered objects and so on. There's not this wonderful, rapid and incredibly skillful use of washes and brush movements and so on. I think the time taken to do a decent work in Western oil painting and the time to do a really good brush drawing are very different. That itself has a different emotional connotation. In one case, you're looking at something which is hard work. In the other case, you're looking at something which is magically
spontaneous.
Spontaneous,
yeah, right.
Yeah.
No, you put your finger on it, Martin. It's it's uncanny the way you do this, but yeah, it has to do with washes, I think. So, for example, and this develops toward the end of the Northern Song. So, again, that 10-foot-long painting I showed you, and I argued that there's a sense of reflected light in there. If you look carefully, it's not made like that Li Cheng painting, which has all those little texture strokes, layers and layers of texture strokes. This is done mostly with washes. And Xu Daoning was the artist, and Guo Ruoxu and other Song critics tell us that he worked more spontaneously and in a sketchy manner, which people very much appreciated. But that meant that he was focusing especially on the light and the mist, okay? And then by the time you get to the Southern Song, you can get really rapid paintings from artists like Liang Kai in the early 13th century, and he's still a very, considered a great master. But those paintings in the Met that I mentioned, I think they were for an open market, but they're very fine, and yet they could have been done quite rapidly. Because I'll just give you one example of the technical difference. If you look at a court painting by Ma Yuan or Xia Gui, they wet the brush, they dip the tip in the ink, and then they run it pressured like this, somewhat horizontally, to create a gradual gradient from sharp black to lighter gray until it disappears in mist. That's how they get this misty effect. Yeah. But these paintings in the Met, you can see that a line was drawn down first, a very light line. The artist very quickly drew in the light lines that worked out the mountain outlines, and then he came back later and put in the wash. Yeah. The court painters would never have done that. They were a single stroke, basically. Yeah.
Occurs to me in European art, the first person who does that level of very quick washing to create amazing effects is Turner. And you can go to the Tate Gallery, and Turner did colour beginnings. That's to say, before the castle was there or anything is there, he just did these sweeps of colour very rapidly. And they provided the the background to the paintings, and he often would add not very much, just a line, a comma or whatever, and some form would emerge. Whistler also did that. Looking out at, last night we did sunset on the sea out there, and it looked like a Whistler. There were these bands of very freshly done colour. He used pastel as well, but that comes late. I mean, this is 19th century and early 20th century. And Ruskin, of course, got wind of got irritated by the sheer casualness of Whistler and took legal. He said this is, and Whistler took him to court for denigrating him, throwing a paint of pigment in the face of the public. And that was because it was casual, it was quick. It wasn't pre-Raphaelite, it wasn't all done very carefully. Although paradoxically, Ruskin, of course, liked Turner. The last thing you expect from Ruskin is consistency.
Well, to resurrect Gombrich again, I'm wondering if that has to do with the sense of decorum, that it was a breach of decorum to work in such a brief manner in Europe. It seems that skill remained an important criterion until fairly late, at least end of the 18th century, if not later. In China, skill, obvious skill, overt skill, as you could tell from those quotes I showed you, comes under attack already by the 1070s or thereabouts by the literati. Now, in fact, their paintings are very skillful, but they're also careful not to be skillful in an obvious way, right? In a way that the average person would say, oh my God, that took a lot of time to paint. It's skillful in terms of its references to art history or its distortions of space. There are other scales of value there, but and then also the washes. About the same time, you get a spontaneity in both cases. The same term, actually, 自然, comes to be valued both by the literati and even by the court, although it leads to different consequences. And again, I think it has something to do with the fact that the aristocracy pretty much collapses. Actually, it was destroyed by Song Taizu, and that is the first Song emperor, and the statesmen who were supporting him. They passed, he wasn't in office very long when he passed a law getting rid of primogeniture. And then he went, the political privileges of the old aristocracy went first. The privileges got the axe, not the people. And then the primogeniture, and then the fiscal privileges, and so on. And so by the beginning of the 11th century, they were pretty much defunct. That's something that, oddly, I think is not mentioned much in Chinese high school textbooks, but that's another conversation.
Yeah, there are warnings in Renaissance and later writing as an art of avoiding the frenzy of the artist, of having a measure of control, not letting it run away with you. It happens at Alberti. So that extreme spontaneity is heavily resisted.
I'm wondering if we're supposed to open up to the audience at some time, Liu Laoshi.
好，那我们现在进入问答环节，请问现场有哪位？我们先请李阳老师。
I just say I've never competed with flowers before. It's a bit unnerving.
Yes, thank you very much for wonderful talks, and I learned a lot. And I have two questions. One is more general for both professors, and the other one is for Martin. So my first question is, when we compare a Chinese painting with a Renaissance painting, they indeed look differently from a wide angle, like you see it from a distance. But you look at them closely, they share same structural or same way of observation nature. So my first question is about whether this way of looking at details and looking at the general picture would contribute to our appreciation of and understanding of paintings from different cultures. So my second question is for Martin, and as you mentioned, for Professor Camp. So my first the question is about the common culture or common knowledge shared among those perspectivists. As you mentioned, there are many painters who use perspective in very perfectively and canonically, like Piero del Francesca and Uccello. So my question is how this optical or perspective knowledge was transmitted in the workshops. 好的，我就是有两个问题。第一个问题是，就是当我们在比较这个不同文化的这个艺术作品的时候，我们看到一个中国的山水画和这个西方的一个透视的这么一个油画或者是淡彩画，我们会发现他们的确看起来不太一样。但是当我们走近看的时候，特别是看得很近的时候，我们可以发现他们的一些技法或者说观察自然的这种方式是很相似的。那么我的问题就是关于这种观察的方式会不会影响我们对于这个画作的判断。第二个问题就是一个比较细的问题，就是关于文艺复兴艺术当中这些光学或者是透视的这些知识是如何传播的，特别是如何在这个艺术家的工作坊当中传播的。谢谢。
Do you want to have a go at the first bit first?
Okay, I'll have a crack at it. Yeah, Dr. Liang, thank you. I think you put your finger on something there. It is interesting, and I think both of us made note of this, that in the portrayal of details, like fur texture, rock texture, or even in the portrayal of the whole object, right? Like fish, for example. The Renaissance treatment and Song treatment are easily comparable. They're not identical in any sense, but they're easily comparable in terms of the accuracy of representation. Whereas when you get to the full scene, in other words, how to organize, not just how to organize space, but I think very importantly, how to organize deep space, because this is something very few cultures do, other than the usual high plane recession. Those the solutions found were quite different, but in both cases, the solution found managed to unify the space. I think it's important to understand that before Li Chang, what you get are two horizons typically. If you look at Dongyuan paintings or paintings in the Dongyuan tradition, there's typically two horizons. There's one down toward the bottom, there's another one further up, because he couldn't figure out or didn't want to figure out how to unify the space. Li Chang did that. And again, I suppose Brunelleschi, and then Leonardo, when you get to light and so on, they find ways to unify the space. And as I mentioned before, I think one reason the Chinese took a different route, there are two reasons. One is that they were mainly concerned with landscape. And in a landscape, you have to be able to wander. And so you can unify the horizon, but you could not possibly keep the viewer at one spot. You've got to be able to move back and forth. So that kind of does away with perspective. And the other reason was, again, this emphasis on ut pictura poesis. If I meant to ask you about that, Martin, if you want to put it that way, is that once the Xuanhe Huapu, adopts this theory, which again I think is not unlike Diderot, that nature is expressive by itself, and if you imitate nature, then you can convey emotions. But once you accept that, then you don't want to be restricted to a set of mechanical rules that are going to tie your hands. So I think it's not so much an expression of any kind of Minzu Jingshen as it is simply they were, and Martin has said this in various ways, they were after different things. They were going for a different target.
With regard to perspective and teaching and the books and so on, there's enough to make you wonder is how seriously most artists took this, particularly in the age of the academies. You thought, oh my God, I've got this dreadful course coming up on perspective, which I've got to do. So I think there's a lot more production of theoretical books than were actually really consumed or used. It was a kind of like a five-finger exercise that you could do your perspective, you could, in Renaissance, you could do your Mazzocchio. Turner famously was professor of perspective at the Royal Academy. He was a terrible lecturer. He did these big watercolours, which I think people quite appreciated, but he mumbled, he was unclear, and by the end of his stint as professor of perspective, his father was about the only one going. So I suspect there's a kind of a rough story of perspective neglect which you could produce. There's lots of Dutch treatises on perspective, yet Hobbema, the landscape artist, Ruysdael and so on, there's almost no overt perspective in the paintings at all. Hobbema, there's one, there's the Avenue, that was exceptional. And I did for the Hockney show, we did at the Fitzwilliam and the Hyong Gallery in Downing, my Cambridge gallery, Cambridge College. I did a census of the pictures in the museum under different categories, which I can't now quite remember, but overt perspective effects, implicit perspective effects, and other spatial devices. And I think about 80% of the pictures in the Fitzwilliam, fairly representative old master collection, did not fall in the focused or very advertent part. So it's there, it's underpinned knowledge, but the number of pictures that do that is relatively small. Holland is exceptional, as they got the Dutch church paintings. And some of those are pretty. Samridam is very sophisticated. And there's some very good books in 17th century Holland, Hondius and so on, of architectural and furniture perspective and so on. But I think it's a very uneven picture. The book, The Science of Art, it almost exaggerates the importance of the subject by existing as a book. I think it wasn't taken up as much as the perspective theorists would like. Anyway, there's a good, another, I'm always identifying topics, there's a good topic for someone on the reception of perspective books. Later on, it's interesting where perspective goes. It goes into Monge and projective geometry in the late 18th century. It goes into engineering design. And I've got a treatise on perspective from one of the military academies from about 1880. And they were still teaching perspective and spatial geometry in military academies very late on. And again, you'd think that they'd probably the young people going to be officers, oh, bloody hell, I've got to do this today. And but it's still there as part of the agenda, and somebody considers it's worth doing this.
我看到刚才第三排这位女士。
很高兴又再次见到教授，然后非常感谢刚才两位教授的分享。因为我最近这个大脑有点宕机，还是用中文表述会更清楚一些。一会儿麻烦李阳老师再翻译一下。因为上一周那个教授也讲到了这个绘画的神圣之光，包括他的大师课，以及今天的这个讲座里面多次讲到了一个光的艺术。因为我本人在欧洲比较多，就是经常会在他的这个博物馆、美术馆、教堂和建筑方面看到了很多对光的一个广泛经典运用。刚好前2天那个俄罗斯艺术科学院院士作品展，它的主题也是一个以光为主题，是自然之光、人本之光和心性之光。那么我想问的第一个问题是，这个文艺复兴的光学艺术对俄罗斯艺术发展有着什么样的推进作用？然后第二个是刚才两位教授都在讲这个中西方文化交流的一个事情。那么刚才这位老师也讲到了中国山水画中的三远。那么中国光学它也是有着一个非常长的历史，从墨子的墨经开始就讲到了光学8条，到后来的沈括。古人对成像这个研究的发展，以及在故宫的乾清宫里面有一个组合平镜中的一个古代光学。我的第二个问题是，那么中国的这个光学艺术和这个 文艺复兴的有什么相似和不同之处？因为今天可能这个氛围比较好，所以我的求知欲比较强。第三个问题是，刚才两位教授都讲到了这个世界艺术的一个共通性因为我也比较喜欢非洲的艺术，也会去到非洲、去到埃及去研究一些非洲方面的一些东西。那么我想问的就是，早期的非洲艺术对文艺复兴有着什么样的影响，以及文艺复兴对后期的非洲艺术有着什么样的推动作用？谢谢，谢谢李昂老师。
My answer is definitely yes, and then someone can translate the question.
I'm just like doing like a brief translation for you. So we're quite touched base on the second question this time. So I think we'll skip the second one, just the similarities and difference between Chinese and Renaissance art. But I think it's really interesting of the first one, the third one, mentioning different kind of art in different kind of places. So the first question would be, how does the divine light in your second lecture and also the perspective problems influenced the Russian art? Do you have any knowledges on that? And the third question is that how does African art have influenced Renaissance art in some sense, or African arts? Yeah, so kind of like a worldwide art realm kind of these questions would be. Yep.
Does the question about Russian art relate to Russian icons, so-called, or are we thinking of other Russian art? Sorry? So I'm getting slightly lost with this.
实际世纪坛那个展览跟今天我们谈到的光没什么关系，它是一个比喻吧。Sorry, I think the light titled in the exhibition is totally allegory, not about the optical things. So maybe you can.
No, I'm getting slightly lost here. So there's obviously an important and interesting question, which somehow I'm not managing to take on board.
Yeah, today this is so wonderful venue for us to have very beautiful natural landscape perspective and the academic perspective. I feel that when we talk about the similarity and the differences between Western art and Chinese art, and the ultimate way, the purpose of these two different kinds of art would reach some rather similar goal. Like for Chinese art, you would have very unique perspectives, but the way to do that is because the painting would make people feel really comfortable, because there's no conflict between nature and a subject. I could see everything. I could see everything right at its proper place, so you feel confident. So that's quite different way to respond in Western landscape. For instance, for Turner's painting, sometimes you will feel nervous because the nature is mysterious, overwhelming, whatever. But in Chinese art, the way is to feel the harmonious relationship between nature and human being, so-called 天人合一, oneness of nature and human being. But I guess the Western art also do the similar things, because when you render nature in an accurate way, in terms of light, perspective, whatever, you will feel comfortable as well. So the painting could be very powerful, dramatic things. So probably we should trace back to philosophical ideas behind this kind of quite different art in the West and in China. Well, in China, I guess there's no concept of sublime, for instance. While in the West, there is kind of sublime. And in China, we will have an alternative, like, I don't know how to render in English. Probably it's kind of vastness, but not unlimited vastness. So people will try to figure out, it's called 壮美. It's a magnificent, beautiful, but not overwhelmingly powerful, dramatic, sublime. So when we talk about these conceptual ideology, probably we could deep further into the difference or similarities between Western art and the Chinese art. Could the two professors elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah. No, we're getting into areas of absolutely enormous. Somebody in one of the other lectures said this should lead to a history of images. It occurs to me that we've got it built in there as a history of transcendence, which is rather different in my understanding between transcendence, even in Dante, and transcendence in Chinese art. I'm not come to talk about it, but I can get a sense, an inner sense of something which is rather remarkable. I'm rather conscious, though, the person with the Oxford T-shirt on, we've not really dealt adequately with her question. Can we go a bit further with that? Maren picked out two things. What were the two things you picked out?
Russian art and African art.
Yeah.
Do you have like some like Russian art influenced by Renaissance art, with some like optical sense, or or like some African arts are like influenced by like Renaissance art.
Yeah. Now, Renaissance art and Russian art is an interesting topic, and there is a fundamental common difference which runs through almost all Russian devotional art, and that is the sense of that it's eternal and it's not in time. The naturalistic tradition, the Renaissance, the Madonna sits there, she's in a space which is continuous with yours, she's there in a given space of time, the child may assume a cross. So there's a kind of, there's that quantità continua I talked about, that sense of time. Russian art is differently out of time because it's not in a specific moment. The nature of an icon is it's enduring, it has a spiritual presence in it, it is miracle working, and it's much less circumscribed by the tenets of naturalism and language. One of my doctoral students, Klemena Antonova, wrote a very good thesis, and has been subsequently following it up, not least looking at Florensky and notions of time in Russian art and the eternity of Russian art, that the images are not of yesterday, they're not today, they exist as images across time and for all time. My limited understanding of it, there's a very dramatic difference there, if that makes sense. African art, I'm almost totally incompetent at explaining, but maybe you have an answer to that.
Yeah, I think we would have to compete in who knows less about African art. I expect I would win, but I was wondering, Martin, if there might be another aspect to that question. Of course, modern Chinese artists in the 50s, to some extent, were under the tutelage of Russian artists, who, at that time, I think they were basically the embodiment of the French Academy. Correct me if I'm wrong. They basically had kept alive the French Academy, which of course had been very much influenced by Poussin and David and people like that. And I don't know if that's what was meant by Russian art. If that was what was meant by Russian art, that is to say, sort of 18th, 19th century Russian art based on the French Academy, then ultimately, I suppose the Renaissance had a big impact on that. I don't know if that's what she was thinking of.
Yeah. And there's that very interesting exhibition on at the moment of Chinese art of the kind of mid-19th century through to social realism. The social realism stuff I think is pretty awful, but there's some very beautiful painting there. And they were doing paintings in the 1950s that are absolutely not abstract expressionism or cutting-edge art, but looked at in their own right are very good. There's quite a lot of influence of Monet. There's influence, as you say, of traditional. And these are people, as I understand it, who are teaching in the art academies in China. And there's some terrific paintings.
No, I mean, especially technically, and I gather they learned the French Academy techniques. That is the underdrawing, the underpainting, layer after layer. They did the whole schmear in the traditional way. And I think this persisted until fairly recently, or maybe it's still done. I mean, I think they still do life drawing in the art schools, which I think is a good idea myself, but anyway.
Sure.
好，我们刚刚简略的回到了刚才后排那位女士的问题。包老师，您对刚才丁老师关于壮美的问题有什么补充吗？
我那是哪一个？能不能提醒我？
The microphone's coming, sir.
Yeah, okay, I'm happy to. Thank you very much, Ding Lao Shi. Of course, I would point out that I think the two Martins were more interested in looking at the resemblances because that's rarely done. I mean, the habit since the 19th century has been to look at differences, and sometimes the differences get exaggerated, you know, beyond what is reasonable. I do think, though, that actually I had wanted to speak a bit about the philosophical differences because, and I had mentioned this to Martin privately, that God is out of the picture pretty much in the Chinese case. And therefore, there's no one up there to certify that this is absolutely real. You know, there's no God with Platonic ideas in the head, you know, that are the real things that are being imitated by the artists down here. There's no such framework. And so, you know, Chinese philosophy being monist, right, 一元论, it recognizes that language and art are conventions. These are social conventions, which therefore can be modified. So even when they theorize 形似, right, similitude, they do so understanding that the artist does so by choice. It's not that you have to do that because God wants you to do it. It's because you want to achieve a certain end by adopting a verisimilitude as a technique. So that is very important. At the same time, I would, you know, of course, in history, as you know, Professor Ding, we never say never, right? And we never say always. So, I mean, obviously, there are landscape paintings that are not at all calming, like the one I showed you, the Hou Chi Bi Fu Tu, right? That scene where Su Shi feels the ground shake and the waters are roiled, and he doesn't know what's real and what isn't. You know, that is a violent scene in the Chao, in that hand scroll, Chao Zhongchang hand scroll. And likewise, that final scene is very disturbing. You're looking at Su Shi as a body asleep, and you're also looking at his dream at the same time, and you're looking straight into his bedroom, and you're also looking into his backyard, which has been flipped up 90 degrees, right? So there certainly are, or Xu Wei, for example. I think Xu Wei's paintings are quite violent and disturbing, Bada and so on. But nonetheless, I don't deny in any way your major point about mainstream landscapes really providing a space for the imagination to wander peacefully and to commune with nature. Yeah, so that, but then you get that in the Romantic era in the West, I think. Yeah, one could argue that there are parallels there too.
On depicting of divinity, there's something I'd like to mention, which may seem a bit peripheral, but I think could be quite telling. and that is Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev, the film on the great 15th century icon painter. And I was involved with a man who was researching that in Oxford, and we looked at the Andrei Rublev director's cut, which lasted about 3¼ hours. But the whole of that film is about Andrei Rublev not being able to paint God. That it's simply beyond painting. And there's a wonderful parallel there with late Michelangelo. There was a late Michelangelo drawing show at the British Museum, and the late crucifixion drawings dematerialize the drawing. So it's almost as if he can't portray the ultimate moment. He writes all these poems about the love of God on the cross, and it's too much for him to realize in tangible, measurable, sculptural and definitive form this supreme deity. And that's another theme. Obviously Dante's got that in terms of Paradiso, that you can't envisage that. But for a religious artist who is traditionally going to paint an image of God the Father, it is incredibly difficult. Because once you've got that sense of the ineffable, how do you transcend that? And the Andrei Rublev film, I think, does that. The Tarkovsky very brilliantly. How many people have seen the Andrei Rublev film? Have a look at it. It also happens to have the best casting sequence anywhere. There's a young bell founder is casting a bell, and I show it to my students to say, this is what casting bronze is like. It is like hell. Anyway, let's take away some, look up on the internet on Andrei Rublev. Probably not the full director's cut, which is 3¼ hours, but there's plenty of good stuff even cut down.
好，那谢谢大家的问题啊。那我们最后一个问题给。
Thank you to Martins for. Okay, probably I ask first in Chinese and translate to English myself. 我问题就是 can I just ask in English first? Yeah. I'm wondering. I think my question probably to 包老师. Okay. Because I'm curious about you mentioned about the similarities. About the similarities between Song and Renaissance art, and because Professor Kemp mentions 5 ways of portraying space in previous lectures, and you mentioned we have in China, we have all of this at least in Song Dynasty. So I'm wondering whether we can call it science in China. It's optics in China. Probably we can have a lecture named Optics in China from who to who, but probably we need to broaden the meaning of optics or science, because it sounds a bit absurd, called science in China, right? Yeah. That is my question, and I really appreciate you emphasize the similarities first and mention these contents in it. But I think that's the Pingyuan. This concept is really important because it seems to change a lot. Even in the Renaissance art, we can see Uccello use the different paintings to tell stories, and we have triptych art in Western tradition, but because it lacks the this level distance, lacks the theory of level distance, so it's really level distance. Pingyuan. Yeah. You mentioned the Pingyuan is the important concept in China, and I noticed that you translate 观山水者上平远旷荡 And quantum you translate as deep space. It's
Right.
a Western theory.
Right,
But we
puts them
have the
together.
level distance here.
Right.
But according to my understanding of the whole lecture and the discussions, but when we have this concept, a lot of things changed. Because even if we tell stories like a way of doing this, even we have this kind of tradition in Western world, but it's different. It's also one picture and another picture and a third one. But in China, it's different, right? So I'm wondering whether when this concept appears,
Which concept?
the level distance.
Oh, yeah, that I think we know fairly well. But I think there's several interesting ideas in what you're saying.
Sorry, probably I need to translate in
Okay.
Chinese first. 就是我的问题，就第一个问题是说，就是在坎普教授最后提到的那5个方面，就是在表现空间的那5个方面，西方也有。然后包老师是后面的一个对话是说，其实在中国到宋代有这样的一些传统，其实都有前面的那些表现形式。那么我就想问说，那在中国的这个里面，能不能把它叫做科学？好像如果把它叫做科学的话，听起来有点怪，或者我们需要或者叫做光学。我们需要如果可以的话，我们或者需要就是扩大这个科学或者是这个光学的概念。然后第二个问题是说，就是我能够就是我非常欣赏包老师，就是他把它放在一个相似的框架之下，然后再来讨论一些不同的内容，这样会给我们一个更大的一个视野，不像以前做比较是说主要强调一个不同，这样的话会带来更多的讨论的空间。但我就觉得在中间我有一个比较好奇的，就是这个平远的概念，就是好像就是在包老师的这个评价当中，这个平远就是它作为一条嘛，就是我们发明了这个平远的，就是您说发明制造深空错觉的特殊装置平远。但我好像感觉这个平远的概念似乎比其他条要重要的多，它好像会带来一个整个中国的这个 landscape 的一个改变，就是在这个如果说有前面那5个标准，再加上这个平远，好像前面那5个标准就会有不一样的一个途径。所以我想就是听一下两位老师的这个意见。
我有一点耳聋，所以我不知道我有没有完全听清楚。But I'll do my best. I think there are a number of interesting ideas here, but I'm wondering if what's underlying it, and I could be wrong here, is a different emphasis on difference and similarity. Again, Martin and I were both interested in similarities, and I think the reason is that we're historians, and we recognize that developments in history are usually not propelled by some kind of Volksgeist or Minzu Jingshen, right, or some kind of spirit or something like that. They happen because people are trying to solve problems, and people are people everywhere, and they're trying to solve problems, and so it's not surprising they end up developing banking, for example. I think the Italians were very good at that, were they not? And the Chinese had banking very early also, and it wasn't, I don't think it was influence. I often use a very banal example, chopsticks and knives and forks. These are 2 different solutions to the same problem. And, of course, we could say, well, no, but chopsticks are not really eating utensils because the Western ones, you can cut up, with the Western ones, you can cut up the meat on the plate, whereas with the Chinese ones, the meat has to be cut up in the kitchen. So the Chinese solution is not real. But of course, that is to set up a hierarchy without any basis. The fact is you've got 2 perfectly good solutions. I like eating with both chopsticks and knives and forks. I find chopsticks especially good with salad. You could pick up little pieces that you can't get with your fork. But anyway, so I think with deep space, what we have here is a solution that was recognized in Europe. I think Professor Kemp's research shows this very clearly. The Europeans recognize, oh wow, this does the job, and this is the standard, and this gives us a unified space. And and even when they didn't do it to the letter, nonetheless, if it's close enough, it gives you a unified space. Chinese critics likewise recognize that Pingyuan did that. It created a unified space unlike anything before that. So all the Song critics recognize that pre-Li Cheng and post-Li Cheng is two different worlds. And that's what allows the Song literati actually to break those rules and go back to Nanbeichao or Tang Dynasty styles and resurrect them again, because they recognize that this is the watershed, this is the limit. He did that, now we're free to go back and do other things. So in both cases, this was articulated really quite distinctly. Now, this guy solved the problem, and in both cases, people respond like, "Wow, that's astonishing." I quoted, I think Dong You, right? People would look at a Li Cheng and they say, "Oh my God, how can that be real? How did he do that? It looks like the real thing." And we have Guo Ruoxu also says basically the same thing. So this is, I think a historian looks at that, and just as with eating utensils, rather than figure out, well, yeah, but which one is the right one, we would say, under what conditions do people develop eating utensils, right? What is it that prompts the development of knives and forks or chopsticks, whatever? Bread, if you consider that an eating utensil, then that could be another way. Because most cultures throughout history didn't do this at all. So we would want to ask, well, under what conditions does this happen? What is it that's prompting this, and what can we learn from the differences? This is the point. Once you recognize the similarities, then you can go into the differences, and I think that's what you want to do, right? And say, okay, what can we learn from, the use of Pingyuan as opposed to one-point perspective, and 各有所长, right? So what are the advantages of doing this and of doing that? And I think you'll usually find that people choose this way or that way based on what kind of works best for them. Yeah. But I hope I didn't totally mangle your question. If I did, I'm sorry. I need to get your 助听器。
好的，谢谢大家的问题，也感谢两位老师的解答。那我在此也想预告一下2024年嘉座书局年度文化活动不好意思，之后的讲座安排。那么在第一场在 UCC 尤伦斯当代艺术中心的报告厅，第二场在中央美术学院的讲座和工作坊，以及今天在如诗海度假村之后，那么下一场也就是最后一场讲座会于9月24日在中国美术学院南山校区北院报告厅举办。那么肯普教授到时候也会跟中国美术学院的杨思良教授进行对谈。那肯普教授会分享艺术与科学中的直觉结构，那么这个 structural intuitions 也是肯普教授研究的一个非常中心的一个重点。那么欢迎您进入我们的公众号和视频号点击预约，方便您后续收看。那么也非常希望各位能够关注我们的公众号和视频号方便您接收更多的书籍资讯和活动信息。好，那我们稍后会有签售环节，请各位先在门外的文献区稍等片刻，我们布置一下签售区之后，会请您再进来跟教授们继续讨论和签售。谢谢再次欢迎大家的到来，以及预祝大家中秋节快乐。
Yeah, absolutely. Hello, my name is Martin Kemp. I'm Professor Emeritus History of Art at University of Oxford. My research area has been concerned with art and science in a broad sense, but the imagery in science and how it interacts with the imagery in art. An obvious place to go and where I ended up is with Leonardo, because Leonardo da Vinci obviously is a scientist, he's a technologist, he's an artist, and he's all these things. Renaissance artists about how we see, what we see, how do we express emotions, how does movement work, and there are a whole lot of questions which are essentially overlapping between the areas of science and art. This all sounds somewhat academic, but in fact the visuals are very compelling. The relationship between science and art is something which can cross boundaries and get public interest. You break down the borders and you create something which is really inventive, interesting, and has fundamental insights into the human condition, to put it at its most extreme. But these are some of the great cultural movements, after all, in China and Renaissance at about the same time. It's between what Chinese artists were doing with nature and what Renaissance artists were doing with nature. They didn't look the same, but